It is my honor to introduce all of you to Blake Gopnik tonight. Blake is one of North America's leading art critics and is the author of the comprehensive biography Warhol. He has served as the art and design critic at Newsweek and is the chief art critic at the Washington Post and Canada's The Globe and Mail. In 2017, he was a Cullman Center Fellow in Residence at the New York Public Library, and in 2015, he held a fellowship at the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the City University of New York. He has a PhD in art history from Oxford and is a regular contributor to the New York Times. This evening, he will be talking about his new book, The Maverick's Museum, Albert Barnes and His American Dream. In this compelling portrait of Albert Barnes, Gopnik introduces us to a true champion of art, whose progressive ideals in democratizing the art world made him into a divisive figure. Publishers Weekly called this book a vibrant and comprehensive portrait of an influential figure in American art history. Tonight, Blake will be in conversation with Robin Givhan. Robin is the Washington Post's senior critic at large, writing about politics, race, and the arts. Previously, she covered the fashion industry as a business, as a cultural institution, and as pure pleasure. She is the 2006 Pulitzer Prize winner for criticism and author of The Battle of Versailles, the night American fashion stumbled into the spotlight and made history. In addition to the Post, Robin has worked at Newsweek, Daily Beast, Vogue magazine, and the Detroit Free Press. Everyone, let us all welcome Blake Gopnik and Robin Givhan.
You can tell I've got relatives in the crowd.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I love this book, and it is very, it's a little racy.
Oh, I hope so.
Very good. The first thing that I was really curious about is you had spent years sitting with Warhol. And I wonder why you decided to shift your attention from an artist to a collector.
You know, the honest to God reason has to do not with the world outside with collectors or artists, but with me as a writer and historian. I discovered that there was this amazing archive, the Barnes Foundation, and I'm a real archives rat. And the idea of being able to write about someone who at least was tangentially associated with art, but had a great archive, really was irresistible for me. And it turned out, I thought Warhol's archive was insane. He saved every taxi receipt, contract, etc. Turns out Barnes saved as much, if not more. Which turned out, at first I was very excited by this, but of course after a little while it was a nightmare trying to figure out what to look at. How do you decide in hundreds of thousands of pages of documents which ones to look at and which ones not to look at? You don't have your whole life to do something like this.
How far back did his archive go? Was he saving things even as a young man growing up in the neck?
No, he really started, what's the earliest document? When he first got successful selling, making drugs, his one product that made him famous. Yes, that's right. Medications, that's right. So that's really when it starts. But there's a little scraps of evidence about his early life. He talked about it. He became famous enough that he gave lectures about his early life and things like that. So that helped. Of course, he was also an unbelievable liar. He was just as happy, like Warhol, he was happier to make up a story than to tell the truth. So there's, as a biographer, you choose between whether you want to tell the truth that's boring or go with their fabulous stories, and you kind of try to have a middle way between the two.
Well, that brings me to me the most fascinating thing about him, which is that, in one chapter you think he is this extraordinarily progressive, upright guy, and then in the next chapter you're just like, what and obviously, people can be all of those things, but I was hoping you could talk about sort of the saintly version of Barnes, the guy who was promoting women to really high levels of authority, the guy who was, was interested in uplifting Black people, the one who just thought that he could democratize art.
Yeah, he was Mr. DEI, which of course today could be a problem. Why don't I read a tiny little bit of the very beginning of the book that sets him up as someone who isn't horribly evil. Maybe in the second half of this we'll talk about how evil he could be. But let's talk
Set this up, because he's like,
Let's see him as a saint for a minute. Early in 1924, the editors of Ex Libris, a Parisian magazine that published in English, had asked Barnes to contribute an article on African art as, they said, the basis of the whole modern movement. And Barnes has agreed. But only, he said, so long as he could range far beyond that to cover what African Americans had achieved in thought, literature, music, and the living of art expression in everyday life. Barnes explained that he'd lived and worked, as he said, with black people for more than 20 years. And as human beings and as artists in living, I have the highest respect for them. His article described black people's subjection, as he put it, to the fundamentally alien influence of their Anglo-Saxon oppressors, an oppression that was still ongoing, Barnes said, and how that led to the soul-stirring experiences which always find their expression in great art. For whites, he said, art and religion had become obsolete and meaningless forms, whereas spirituals, an African-American art form Barnes had known since childhood, ranked, he said, with the biblical poetry that stood at the root of all Christian letters. Those spirituals, Barnes insisted, were the single form of great art which America can claim as her own. Up there with the great cathedrals of Europe, he felt. And he was asserting all this at a moment after World War I, when the search was on for a new and uniquely American culture, worthy of the nation's new place on the world stage. According to Barnes, that new culture might end up being more black than white, especially since Americans' nascent modernism was really just an offshoot of the European version, and that, he claimed, was based on African models anyways. And Barnes was daring to make such claims in a country where a lynching took place at least once a month, and the Ku Klux Klan could count millions of members, where whites were busy burning down black businesses and neighborhoods from Wilmington to Chicago to Omaha. It was a country where the hierarchy of races and the pseudoscience of eugenics were taught in pretty much every university, and yet Barnes managed to hold up blacks as, at least on many dimensions, superior to whites.
That is quite a mouthful.
1924. In 1924.
Where do you think that came from? He talked, in the book you talk about his growing up and his experiences in black churches. I mean, did it simply come from his having those sorts of intimate moments when, people let down their guard?
I think that was part of it, but I think its real origin were in his early years. He was the son of a butcher who fought in the Civil War and lost an arm. And for a little while, because of federal pensions, the family did okay, but they started to tumble really badly. And he ended up growing up, spending the second half of his childhood in the Neck, which was a neighborhood that you can't imagine what a bad slum it was. People would come from around the country to sort of ogle this horrible slum. So it was really horrible. And ever after, I think, he saw himself as an underdog, even when he became fabulously rich and powerful, and was always, at least in rhetoric, and often, in fact, a supporter of underdogs of all kinds. So he collected women artists, deliberately went out to collect women artists and to talk about how great they were as women artists in the 1920s. I don't know if anyone else even thinking about those issues. And then, of course, he paid his black employees in the factory more than even white employees in factories earned. And in fact, in Philadelphia was so racist and segregated You weren't even supposed to employ blacks in a factory. That was considered too good for black workers. They were supposed to be boot blacks. And I think he was always, deep down, saw himself as an underdog and thought, I'm going to support other underdogs. And those people were often people of color or women.
Do you think that those attitudes attributed to both his success and also his sensibility when it came to collecting?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for us to see it now, but when he started collecting in 1912, the artists he was collecting were cultural underdogs, especially in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was famous at the time as sort of the home of American blue bloods, right? It wasn't the working class town it is now. And those artists were, I mean, it's hard to even kind of recognize how reviled they were. Figures that we now accept now. Cézannes, I mean, not even radicals, but Cézannes, let alone Picasso, were just, I mean, Barnes could be mean, but the critics talking about him were actually meaner even than I was when I was a critic of the Prose. They, I wish I could have written the kind of vituperation that they did when they talked about Barnes's own art. And clearly, he thought that he was buying this fabulous stuff and that he'd be loved for it. And when he got this reaction from the local establishment, local critics, that he was always capable of dyspepsia, but that really put him over the edge and made him a kind of lunatic for the rest of his life.
We were talking about this a little bit earlier, and I said I was so struck by, as he sort of got into his collecting, that he would go to Europe and come back with dozens of paintings, like dozens of Renoirs. And I thought,
hundreds of goddamn Renoirs.
So, I mean, is that just sort of like part of what it means to be a collector, that on some level you have a kind of mania? Or was it a reflection of just the incredible bounty of art that was available at that time, that it was very easy to fall in love with a dozen paintings on one trip?
I mean, I think it was an unbelievably exciting moment to be interested, to have any tolerance for modernism, right? It is the birth of 20th century modernism. So it was not hard to be excited if you had a decent sized fortune. He was no Rockefeller, but he had this one product which was an antiseptic that helped cure infantile ocular gonorrhea. Sounds almost comical. You wonder what are these infants doing to get ocular gonorrhea. But all they were doing was being born through the mother's birth canals. And at the time, tens of thousands of infants went blind soon after birth because of gonorrhea. And this product he invented was a very powerful antiseptic that had the benefit of not destroying eye tissue or other sensitive tissues, as Barnes used to put it. So it was just hugely successful, and he was able to sell it. And the reason I'm saying all this is because that's what let him go crazy and buy art, which was modernism was surprisingly cheap. He did not, other American collectors were buying Raphael or especially, British 18th century artists. He went out and bought the cheap stuff, which was Cézannes and Renoir to a certain extent, but especially Picasso or the artists he discovered,
And did anyone think that he was being gluttonous? Is it just me that I find it somewhat obscene that you have so much art?
I think that you haven't been maybe quite as exposed to gluttonous collectors as I have been. By definition, if you wear the hat of a collector, that's saying, look at me, I'm a glutton, right? Otherwise, you're just a person who puts some art on the walls. If you're a collector, then you have this overwhelming urge, and it comes from all sorts of places. It comes from a love of art. With almost all collectors, and certainly Barnes, it comes from a love of shopping. It's not that different to... There you go. Yeah, I know you only have the one pair of shoes. I'm sure your closet is one pair of shoes. But he, as you put it so beautifully a few minutes ago, was the Imelda Marcos of modern art, right? Especially of those, I don't know how I should put this, of the frankly hideous Renoir nudes, of which he collected dozens and dozens and dozens, the very late Renoir nudes, which everyone else loved at the time too. Picasso loved them, Matisses loved them. Everyone thought they were some of the greatest art ever, and they were wrong. But there you go.
Well, the other side of him, despite elevating women, despite collecting their art, despite, which I found fascinating, deciding that when he actually did create the foundation, that he wanted it connected to Lincoln University, a historically Black university. He also betrayed some pretty nasty anti-Semitism, racism. I mean, how do you balance those two things?
Yeah, that's hard. As a biographer, it was hard. I tried to give them almost exactly equal play in the book, but there's a sort of biographer syndrome where you almost always end up being, a fan of the figure that you spend years and years studying, and that's a problem. But the truth is, with Barnes, he was kind of an equal opportunity insulter. That is, he didn't really care about the content of the insult. If he decided to hurt you, he would choose whatever was the best way to hurt you. So, if a great Jewish art historian wrote something he disapproved of, he used horrible anti-Semitism in his writing to him. And yet he went out of his way to hire a young Jewish woman only because he knew no one else would hire her because she was Jewish. His second in command all of his second in commands, or I guess second, third, and fourth in command, were women, and one of them was a Jewish woman who he knew was Jewish. So when it was convenient to him to insult you anti-Semitically, he'd do it, but only to hurt you, right? I mean, not because he actually cared about the anti-Semitism. And I think that was true with Black's. He used the N-word when it was, again, convenient to him. There's a nasty episode where the local developer decides to build small but very nice middle-class houses.
Oh, I love this story.
Yeah, it's crazy. Next to his the grand grounds of the foundation he built. And he says, that's great, good, I'm going to move my collection to the Metropolitan Museum, I'll give it to the Metropolitan, I'm going to turn my entire foundation into a center for African American culture. And of course,
knowing that
the goal was not to actually help African Americans at that point. The goal was to get the local zoning authority to say, no, don't build the little houses, because they were all fierce racists, and he knew it, and he said at the time to his lawyer, I'm obviously playing the race card to get my way. It's a horrible, nasty episode, and he loses. The good thing is that he loses. They build the little houses anyways, and those little houses are still there, right next door to his foundation. But, if I may, I think he would. It's not that he wouldn't have been unhappy if a Center for African American Culture had grown up, in the neighborhood. He genuinely believed in the idea of an African American culture. He just wasn't going to turn his foundation into such a thing.
Well, one of the things that you address is the idea that he enjoyed being able to be so open-minded and obliging because it made him feel bigger.
Yeah, I think this is often the case with all sorts of philanthropists. It's by helping the little guy, it makes you learn what a big guy you are. And that's certainly the case with him. It empowers people to be able to help the underdog. It proves you're an overdog. And I think that's commonplace among philanthropists. The opposite is rare, where it's not about asserting your own power. The other thing that I think is important is that, he could be just the most vicious, vituperative person in the world, and he thought that was funny. He thought it was hilarious to be ruder than anyone else had ever been in the history of America. Can I read a little passage of his rudeness? And it is funny. When he does it well, when he doesn't use the N-word, when he doesn't use words like kike and heave, it can be very funny. Okay, so there was a young Columbia University professor, very young, 26 years old, who asked to see the art at the Barnes Foundation, but didn't want to be lectured about it by Barnes. And when Barnes said, no, you can't come, he responded, this young Columbia colleague responded, I take it, sir, that you do not recognize educational activity unless it is officially designated as such by the presence of a teacher. And then he pretentiously went on and on to explain how this was no longer the right way of thinking about education, etc. So Barnes sat down to write a reply, signing it Peter Kelly, 3rd Assistant Mailing Clerk. And I'll quote it at length. Sir, he writes to the Columbia professor, when your letter of December 26th arrived, I felt I had made a faux pas of some kind, and I hastened to lay the matter before Dr. Barnes. Unfortunately, the conditions were not favorable, as you can imagine when I give you some of the details. A group of French artists are spending the Christmas holidays at the Foundation, and this morning I found them seated around the table with empty bottles strewn everywhere about. Several effigies, obviously of modern contemporary artists, were seated at the table, and one of them, who resembled Cézannes, had his lips manipulated by one of the other artists and was singing a ribald song in which the whole group joined in chorus. I learned that the party had been in continuous session since Saturday night. When I attempted to get Dr. Barnes' attention to your letter, he playfully threw a bottle at me and resumed his singing. From what I know of similar parties, I fear it will be several days before Dr. Barnes will be in condition to consider your proposition to bring your friends to the gallery at any old time, that their other engagements permit them to come here. So that's genuinely funny. And I think even when he was being ultra nasty and racist and sexist, etc., he thought he was being funny in that way. He wasn't really good at distinguishing between the comic vituperation and just nastiness.
What was his relationship with his wife like? I mean, did he
I
have that same kind of attitude towards her?
I wish I knew more about that. She's clearly, I refer to her as the grayest of éminence grise. She's clearly hugely important. John Dewey, the great, great philosopher, at the time the most famous intellectual in America, was Barnes's best friend. And John Dewey was the most mild-mannered man in the world, and yet he was best friends with Albert Barnes, the least mild-mannered man in the world. And John Dewey said that Laura Barnes was the secret force behind everything that Barnes did. Unfortunately, she seems to have destroyed all of her private papers after death, or had them destroyed, so we know almost nothing about her. There are anecdotes that probably are true showing Barnes treating her pretty terribly, saying things like, "Laura, my pipe!" after a meal, and she, I think ran off to get his pipe. He was an old-fashioned patriarch. He just was less of an asshole as an old-fashioned patriarch than some. It's important to remember that we think of him as a figure of the 20th century, but he was born in 1872. He's really a Victorian figure. By the time he starts collecting the art, he's, well into middle age. So his fundamental ideas are formed in the Victorian era and never completely change.
Well, one of the things that was very progressive to me was this idea that he had about sort of the democratizing nature of art. And it seemed also quite relevant in these times because he really seemed to believe that art could help people to understand others, to understand themselves, and the idea that there shouldn't be someone telling them what to think.
Yeah. Except him. Except him. And he pretended he wasn't telling people what to think, just how to think, which is a slightly different thing. His ideas about art are really incredibly interesting, and I think people don't realize how influential they are. The main model for art appreciation, right through my childhood, including affecting my parents, was formalism, where you only paid attention to the color of a picture, the lines, the forms, the composition, and you did your best to ignore what it was a picture of and not to talk about it. And he was a vitally important figure in that movement. In 1925, he published a book that's utterly forgotten today called Painting as an Art. And it's forgotten for good reasons. It's unbelievably unreadable. But it was hugely influential at the time and advanced this formalist model. But, and this finally gets to your question, he thought the great thing about formalist readings of art is that anyone could do it. You didn't have to know about the Bible. You didn't have to know about ancient Greek myths, right? You just looked at the goddamn thing, and your innate capacities as a human being allowed you to appreciate it as art. So it's weird because we think of formalism as kind of the house manor of the Museum of Modern Art is extremely elitist. I mean, most people, when they look at a picture, they say, oh, look, it's a pretty picture of a dog, right? Or they care about the subject matter. But he saw it as democratizing. He saw it as a way for everyone in the culture to be able to appreciate art. And in fact, he hung paintings, modernist paintings, in the factory and allowed his workers to spend 2 hours a day contemplating the paintings. They took notes. So many of his workers were illiterate, so their literate colleagues had to write down what they thought about the work. I mean, it's kind of an amazing thing, and you were more likely to get access to the Barnes Foundation if you pretended at least to be a miner than if you were actually a mine owner.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall that he actually allowed, did he sell some of the art to people who worked in his factory?
He certainly encouraged them to buy it. In fact, yes, you're right. He sold works that he had bought for the same amount he bought them for, which means that over time, the workers got a great deal. Now, I don't think the workers on the factory floor were taking advantage of this, but certainly the white women who worked in the back office, and that's another thing that's amazing. The last thing you were supposed to do was have black men working with white women, right, in segregated Philadelphia, and yet he insisted on that. He created a situation where that would happen. And he, or now I've lost my train of thought.
The purchasing of the art on the floor.
Oh, and he really encouraged the everyday people in his office in his factory to learn about advanced ideas in philosophy. I mean, 2 hours a day they would do seminars on Bertrand Russell and John Dewey. I mean, just amazing stuff that he encouraged his workers to engage with.
Then, brings me to what I think most people, even if they know nothing about Barnes, they know about the Barnes Foundation and these incredibly suffocating rules that govern it. So how do you reconcile this guy who's saying, everybody come, look at art, it's democratizing, you don't have to be a stuffed shirt in order to understand it, and
I will tell you how not to be a stuffed shirt, right?
And I would let 5 people in, in a month.
Yeah, it's a weird contradiction. I mean, he believed in his ideals so strongly that he insisted that they were the only possible ideals, and if you didn't believe in them, you weren't going to get in. He was the only fascist Democrat who's ever been, or maybe, no, not the only one, unfortunately, we're the lost. He was a madman. He was a deeply unusual person. I think, importantly, much smarter than people realize. He was so nutty, and it's so much fun to talk about his nuttiness, that people don't realize that he was actually smart, not in kind of the inchoate way that collectors and sometimes artists are. He was old-fashioned, intellectually smart. John Dewey said he was the smartest person he'd ever met, and John Dewey met every smart person of the early 20th century. But he was so nutty, people of his own day, and certainly today, we can hardly even tell that he was smart. There was a huge profile of him in Saturday Evening Post in 1941, I guess it was. Went on for 4 issues of the Saturday Evening Post, and he'd encouraged the writer to write it. He'd even given him juicy anecdotes, knowing that would help sell the story. And then when it came out, he was just heartbroken and furious, and of course launched lawsuits against the Saturday Evening Post, which he lost. Because though he wanted to be recognized as a maniac, he also wanted to be recognized as someone brilliant. As a genius. And you distract people when you're a maniac. It's harder to recognize your good qualities when your bad ones are so front and center.
Well, and he always changed his mind so much that you just sort of never knew where you really stood with him. And the description sadly, of his death, in which Lincoln University sort of ends up having this relationship with the foundation, is so ironic to me because it seemed like the only reason they were able to get this relationship was because he died before he could change his mind, which he had changed like 3 or 4 times before that.
Yeah, I mean, he tried to have a relationship like that with Penn again and again. He'd have a relationship with Penn, and they would see dollar signs and think, okay, let's try to humor this guy. But then he behaved so insanely that they couldn't anymore. This happened over and over. Renoir. There's a letter in here I was going to read, but decided it was too evil, where he talks about, how can I put this? The gynecological test he's going to do on the women professors at Renoir, and the proctological test he's going to do on the male professors before he'll allow them in. This is after he turned against them. He did this with every institution you can imagine. But luckily for Lincoln, well, it was as polite as I could make it. But Lincoln is sort of the last one, and the story of his death is so Barnesian in a sense. So Barnes had a country house an hour from the foundation, and going there, taking the routes there, he realized it was a very dangerous intersection where a larger highway met a smaller highway. So of course he forced the local authorities to put up a stop sign, right? You didn't contradict Barnes, they did it, they put up a stop sign. One day in summer of 1951, he gets into his Packard, his latest Packard, and one of my favorite things about the Barnes archive is that he kept all of the correspondence with the people who sold him cars. Now, I don't even know how to drive, but I had so much fun finding out what the cars were that he drove. He loved the most luxurious cars of every moment in his life. So you get to study cars from I think the first one is 06, all the way through. He changes his car every year to the latest model, crashes them constantly. He comes so close to death, destroys his gorgeous Packards one after another. But in the summer of 1951, he's had the stop sign installed. Of course, he's driving down the small road that dangerously meets the highway. Does he stop for his own stop sign? No. Tractor trailer carrying 10 tons of newsprint crashes into his car. And one of my favorite discoveries in this book is I found a photograph of the car. It was very hard to find. Found a photograph of the car after the accident. You have never seen a car as totaled as that car was. And of course, he was totaled. And his poor little dog, Fidel, also died. Fidel is the nicest person in this book. Fidel is the real hero. And
it's like the child that he didn't have.
Yeah, he never had kids, and I was never able to figure out exactly how or why they didn't. Fidel, there's another good side to Barnes. He loved that dog and all dogs like crazy. He was a genuine animal lover, which isn't nothing. That means, well, you're a dog lover, so, I'm a cat lover, so that's why I hate Barnes. But he's a deeply conflicted and interesting guy, and built this amazing collection. I mean, that's the only thing that really matters in the long run, is that he made all this art available to the general public eventually, after many lawsuits.
That was kind of going to be my last question before we open up to the audience for your questions. As a critic, when you think about his collection, what is your estimation of it?
The Cézannes, I think there's 75 or so Cézannes, are unbelievable. There are other, it's funny, I went to Barnes, I'm originally from Philadelphia and went back to visit some relatives when I was 13. Went to the Barnes when it was out on the main line in the suburbs, to the original Barnes Foundation, and fell in love with a bunch of artists I'd never heard of. And that's one of the great things, is to collect unusual American artists as well as famous artists. And what I like about it, so to this day, they moved the whole Barnes, lock, stock, and barrel, to Center City, Philadelphia, right near the Philadelphia Museum of Art, to the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. But the judge who let them do that, after much fighting, said every single detail had to be kept the same on the interior of the building. Every picture had to be within a millimeter of where it was originally. So when you go in there, it's still exactly the way it was in Barnes's day, which includes endless old hinges on the wall. I mean, it's very eccentric. The good thing about that is that you're constantly being surprised. because you don't know when you're going to come across a Cézanne. You walk into a room, you don't know where to look, and that means that you discover unusual works you might not have looked at, a Soutine, or an artist whose name you don't even know. So you can go back as many times as you want, because you can never really figure it out. There's no plot line to it. And that's kind of amazing. I don't think that's what he had in mind, but in the long run, that's the effect. And bottom line, all that really matters in any museum is there great art to look at, and do you have room to look at it? Are you allowed to look at it? There are no wall tests at the Barnes, which in my opinion isn't the worst thing in the world. Though they have a fabulously good app where you just point your cell phone lens at the work and text comes up about it. It recognizes what work you're looking at, and that's really clever. But it's still one of the great places to look at great art, except for the 100 or so Renoir news. The goal of the rest of my life as an art critic has to be to figure out how to like them. Because Barnes did. Barnes wasn't an idiot. Picasso did. Matisses did. Everyone thought this was the greatest late 19th century art. They felt it was the first attempt at real modernism. Because the breasts are all perfect half cylinders. If you're a formalist, and the colors are all good pinks, he's good at pink. So the rest of my life, I'm going to have to figure out how to like them. In 20 years, we'll have this discussion again, and I'll say, yes, now I understand. The Renoirs, forget the Cézannes. It's all about the Renoirs. They should take on everything except the late Renoir. Barnes was right. I aim to get to the point of saying Barnes was right. On that note, you guys have a chance to tell me why Barnes was wrong.
Yes, please bring your questions to this lovely microphone here. Don't be shy.
Come on, I've got relatives here. Someone's got to be willing to be mean.
Hey Blake, thanks so much for doing this, and thanks for the great questions. I wanted to know, because we're in Washington, about Barnes and Phillips. If they got along, didn't get along, I think they were rivals a little bit as collectors. And what's your impression of the two people and the two museums, if you can? Thanks.
Well, unfortunately, you're too late to sign up for my talk tomorrow because it's all sold out, which is on exactly that topic. But my very brief version, I'll be talking at the Phillips with Jonathan Pinstock, the new director there. As the British say, we were chalk and cheese. Duncan Phillips was an elegant, gracious, mild-mannered, kind of aristocratic character. Everything Barnes hated. Now, it is important to recognize Barnes got to modern art before Phillips by quite a bit. Phillips, in 1912, was still very conservative, and even when he first opened the Phillips, he had a very hard time with what we think of as important modern art. But they collected some of the same works, Renoirs especially. In fact, there's an almost complete overlap. Soutines, there's lots and lots of overlap between the two collections. Phillips, of course, though also a formalist, an important formalist thinker, was a much more flexible person and didn't torture everyone who came to see his art. There is a small correspondence between them where, of course, Phillips tried to get into the Barnes, and Barnes told him what he could do with his request. It's not as fiery as some of the correspondences, but they were definitely rivals. Barnes bought more. I think the collection is bigger. But the Phillips, and the weird thing about Barnes is that he never really moved on from his 1912 taste. Really, he formed his taste in 1912, Cézannes, Matisses, a little bit of Picasso, bought a little bit of later art, but almost none. Whereas, of course, Phillips kept moving forward. Duncan Phillips gave Rothko his first room. So that's a big difference, and I admire Phillips for it, keeping an open mind. Barnes's mind wasn't the most open of minds, I think it's safe to say.
Yeah. Good evening. I was interested to hear about Barnes's progressive views when it came to hiring women, and I was curious to what extent did that translate his collecting, to how many women artists did he collect with that interest of his?
More than I think any other collector, and interestingly, didn't only collect them, but collect them as women artists. That is, thought that as women artists they were interesting. He led me to discover, I think, a very important figure in early 20th century modernism, a woman called Hélène Perdriat. Has anyone in this room heard of her? I had never even heard of her. I don't think there's ever been a solo show of her. But when you look at contemporary newspapers, they talk about her as this radical female artist. And he did that with a few figures. I mean, there weren't that many female artists to collect at the time. He didn't collect them in depth, but he collected them in infinitely more depth than the people who collected no works by women artists. So that was definitely an interest of his, and it's led me to have an interest in the status of women avant-gardists in the 20s. When you read the newspapers, you realize that they were seen as a phenomenon, that women avant-gardists were something very special. The new woman was the phrase, of course, for all non-traditional women, and they were the markers of new womanhood. And that, as far as I know, is almost completely neglected, so it's something I'm hoping to dig into in the next few years.
It's been a few years. Can you hear me?
Can you lower the mic? Yeah, great.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. It's been a few years since I was at the Barnes Museum, but walking through it, I had a distinct impression of like walking through a Cornell box in terms of a kind of collage of things that I was supposed to make sense of somehow. And I was supposed to get myself inside Barnes's head to try and figure out why this was next to that. So you don't have any sense yourself of how things are connected in the arrangement he created. It's sort of a megalomania, right?
Yeah, I do have a strong sense of what he was doing, unfortunately. So when you look at a single picture, his formalist analysis is pretty sophisticated, right? Unfortunately, that's the problem with his book, his 1925 book on painting, is that he'll start analyzing the formal arrangements of a painting, and 10 pages later, he's still analyzing the formal arrangement. It can be very boring. But that's what he did, very sophisticated, in-depth analysis. When it came to hanging his art, it tends to be very simple-minded. It's all formalist, but there's a big vertical in the center, and then paired horizontals on either side, and the two paired horizontals have pink in them, so it ends up being simple-minded. The good thing about that is that it's so easy to ignore that, right? You get it, you register it right away, and that leads you then to be able to say, I'm going to ignore that because it's trivial, and then I'm going to really sink my teeth into the painting in whatever way I want. I mean, Barnes could stop you from talking in certain ways, and he was famous for kicking people out. If he heard you talk about the content of a painting, you would be literally physically removed from his museum. But he couldn't stop you from thinking whatever you wanted in front of the work. So my guess is there were some people thinking interesting thoughts. I mean, in fact, there's a lovely set of notes about the people visiting the collection in 1920, would have been 25, I guess it was. No, 24. And one of them is a young man called Alfred Barr, who's a Princeton professor, who's looking at the collection. And the note says something like, he's rather shy. And doesn't voice his opinions much. So that was the last time anyone ever said that Alfred Barr, the great founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, was shy. But you could think your own thoughts, luckily, even if you couldn't express them.
So Blake, thinking about your wonderful career, I know, of course, you write a dissertation on Renaissance art. So you've written academic art history. And then you become a distinguished critic in two great newspapers, reviewing exhibitions and writing journalism. When you wrote your Warhol biography, it could have been a one-off. You love Warhol, and you wrote that book. But with this book, it's a second biography. You're a biographer now, it seems, and I'm wondering, what are the pleasures of biography as a form? How have these books changed the way you think about writing yourself as a writer?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I'm definitely an accidental biographer, and I'll just say the second one was a little easier than the first one. My Warhol biography took me 8 years to write, and this one was under 3, luckily, for my sanity. That's a really good question. The truth is, I mostly wear two hats. A hat as a biographer and a hat as a critic. In the Warhol book, I could switch back and forth between the two hats more easily than in this book. I'm mostly a social historian. I mean, I'm lucky that I came of age as an academic. My education, my PhD, was at sort of the ascendant moment for social history. So my training as an art historian was largely a training, especially because I was at Oxford, as a social historian. In fact, People may not know this, but I actually started a PhD as a social historian of 10th century Lombard Italy, reading only Latin contracts, and you may not be surprised to find out I quit that PhD halfway through and moved into 16th century art instead. But my training was as a social historian. So the truth is, this book is mostly, hopefully, decent social history. I'm extremely interested in the progressive movement. And I think we all need to learn more about the progressive movement, because the progressive movement pulled America out of the Gilded Age and made real progress on some dimensions at least. And we certainly need a new progressive movement in our current Gilded Age. So that was really interesting to me, and that's social history. The Warhol book, I did a ton of social history, which I love doing, but it was much more directly related to the art. So I was able to be a social art historian in those cases. So I kept that hat on. My favorite hat in the world is my hat as an art critic. That's the most fun I could ever have in my life, is looking at fabulous shows, such as you've done at the National Gallery, sir, and just sink my teeth into for as many hours as I can until they kick me out. That's my great, great pleasure. And trying to find something important and original to say, which is the greatest challenge anyone could ever have. Biographies of artists, at least, you can do some of that as well, and that's nice. But I think, the Warhol book was almost 1,000 pages. 1,000 pages of my art criticism, I think, might not have me talking about it at Politics and Prose. So I'm happy to have several genres to work in.
Tough question to follow. I had been to the Barnes when it was in the mansion. Was it Marion?
Yeah, Marion.
And I had always loved Renoir until I went to the Barnes there, and I was like, wow, I didn't know Renoir could stink.
He did at first.
Stunned.
Luckily, they have some great early ones.
They have some early ones, and
yeah.
the later Renoirs, it's like, what? He's not cute. That was my. Yeah. It wasn't like I'd ever read about that, or it's just.
And now you changed your mind. Now you love the late Renoirs?
No, no, they're horrible. I wanted to ask about what happened to that mansion after all the art moved, and I don't know if you know about the workings. When I was at the mansion, there was a lot of seeming intrigue that no one would tell me about a lot of political, like, a lot of people were fired or quit. So do you have anything enlightening to say about that?
I wish I should have dug deeper into this, and I never have, because it was sort of off to one side. It's now, I guess it's still owned by the foundation, but it must be rented to St. Joseph's University, which is a Catholic university out there. So it's being used. Also, Barnes's original mansion, before he founded the foundation, built that set of buildings. There was a mansion he lived in before he started collecting. That also is a public building, or used by public institution. And as far as I know, all of that is, owned by the Barnes and rented out. There's still, very importantly, Laura Barnes, his wife, ran the arboretum of the Barnes Foundation. So the Barnes Foundation, from the day it was founded, was an art collection and an arboretum. And she always ran it. I have a fairly black thumb. The book couldn't be infinitely long, so I didn't really dwell on that at all. But that's really important. And the Arboretum was a fairly substantial horticultural center, and still is there and used by, students of forestry and things like that.
What about the politics of moving it to downtown?
Yeah, that was a nightmare, and there are movies, documentaries about it. The book ends in July of 1951 when that truck hits Barnes, and then there's an epilogue, a longish epilogue about what happened afterwards. But it's one hell of a story. I think it was the right thing to do without any question. I really don't care about the desires of a guy born in 1872. We have a right to that art. And in fact, the stuff's on the wall in the same way he wanted it. There were plenty of concessions made to his desires. And now hundreds of thousands of people can see it in central Philadelphia. So for me, it's a win.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tracy. Thank you both for being here. Robin, I love your work as well. I
Can I just say that Robin is the best interlocutor? Robin is so good at doing this, I've decided to bring her with me every time I do it. You know, we're going to get a little bit going on, we'll just go from town to town doing our rating.
I found Barnes through
Can you move a little closer?
through my love of the painting models.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was wondering two things. One, is there a story about how he acquired that particular painting? And two, what are your thoughts on that painting as a critic?
The story is that it was very expensive and he was incredibly happy to get it. I think this is a painting, the models by Seurat, and I should know the exact date on it, 1890, something like that. He was hugely happy to get it because Seurat at the time was a more important figure than he is now. For those of you who don't know Seurat's work, he's the great pointillist, where his pictures are made up of lots and lots of dots. The Afternoon on the Grand Jacques in Chicago is his great masterpiece. Of course, when Barnes got the models, he had to decide that it was better than the picture Chicago had already bought at that time. He was always saying, I love the painting. Like what the previous questioner said about Renoir, there are what's the right word? Sexual issues with it. There are three very, very young girls, barely pubescent girls, naked, presented to the eye of a male collector, a male viewer, a viewer assumed to be male, a painter assumed to be male. But it's a fascinating picture because, of course, his painting, the Afternoon at the Grand Jacques, is in the background of this picture. I mean, it's really almost feels postmodern in its convolutions, its self-referentiality. What I love is that it sits at the Barnes, at the top of the wall. Unfortunately, it's much higher than it's meant to be seen. It should be seen from at eye level. But below it is Cézannes' great card players. So you get 3 naked women above and 3 clothed men below. Now, Barnes, if you'd asked them, would have said it's all about forms in the 2 paintings. But I think that even he, and probably not just subconsciously, but certainly subconsciously, knew that this was extremely interesting to see the way women were looked at, used, if you like, and the way men had agency in the same moment. So I think that's the greatest installational moment. The only moment, actually, almost in the whole museum that matters to me as installation. Because I think that wall is so interesting. It's sort of the best wall, the most prominent wall in the entire museum. These 2 huge pictures, one above the other. Am I a big Seurat fan? I'm not sure. It's not someone I spent a huge amount of time with. I'm a Cézanne guy. The complexity of Cézanne, he's one of a very few artists where I never have a clue what to say about him. He's just so complex and so difficult and delivers again and again and again. He is, if there's the possibility of the opposite of a one-liner, he's the opposite of a one-liner. So for me, Cézanne, whereas Seurat, you can voice cliches. It's easy to wrap him up. He's the dot guy, he's the color guy. He represents, the middle class on holiday in the late 19th century. Whereas Cézanne, it's very hard to find one thing that sums him up. And most things the smartest people try to say about Cézanne are dumber than the paintings, which tells you something about the art. So I'm a Cézanne guy. But I take the Seurat. If someone wants to give it to me, I won't say no. I wish I could remember the amount Barnes paid for it. I think it might have been $20,000, which at the time was a huge amount of money. He was keen on getting that painting. Yeah. You're welcome. Maybe one last question.
Thank you very much for being here and enlightening us about Barnes.
Come close to the microphone.
Thank you very much for being here and enlightening us about Barnes. I have 2 questions. One is, do you have any idea why he did not collect Georgia O'Keeffe, even though he was offered them by Alfred Stieglitz? And the second question is, even though his connection to Lincoln University, why he did not collect Jacob Lawrence?
I don't have a good answer for either. I do have a good answer for the second question. There's a lovely correspondence, a longish correspondence between him and O'Keeffe. He does buy some O'Keeffes and has them in his collection and looks at them, and in the end decides they don't quite work for him, and he makes Stieglitz reimburse him.
Why he made that connection?
I think that for many people, my parents were are sort of mainstream lovers of the mainstream modernist tradition. And O'Keeffe was seen in that era as marginal to that tradition. She's figurative, fundamentally figurative. She could be seen as decorative. He does talk a little bit about, in the letters, about why he's not keen on them. Mostly just says it'll work for me. And he says, that doesn't tell you anything about whether your art is any good. There are all sorts of reasons why someone might or might not like a picture. It's one of the cases where Barnes is incredibly gracious. It's a lovely correspondence where she's kind of wacky and fun and he's gracious. It's a really nice, one of the few really nice correspondences where he could have just been an asshole and said, I think your work sucks, but he doesn't. So that's, I mean, if you read the correspondence, which is either online or will still be, I had to go through the physical archive when I was writing the book, which was kind of fun, but just as I was finishing the book, they started putting tens of thousands of items online. So the entire correspondence with John Dewey's online, his entire very interesting correspondence with Leo Stein is now online, and could be the O'Keeffe is by now too, I'm not sure. It's a lovely, her handwriting alone is worth looking at in the archive. And sorry, the second question was?
Why he did not collect Jacob Lawrence.
Oh, Jacob Lawrence. You know, the truth is he didn't collect a lot of American modernism. He, like Museum of Modern Art, was mostly committed to French modernism, and that was true of a lot of people who saw themselves as sophisticated modernists. He did collect his friends. He collected a select few American modernists that he had collected very early on. So he collected Americans at the very beginning of his collecting, and then that petered off quite a bit. And when he collected them, you had the feeling sometimes he was doing it out of kindness because he knew them. He did collect Horace Pippin, though. He was one of the first collectors of Horace Pippin, quite late in his life, very late, almost at the very end of his life. So that's something.
My third question.
Okay, one more.
Do you know why he rejected Albert Einstein from coming to the Barnes?
He didn't. That's just a rumor. That's not true. There was a whole trip of people coming from the Center for Advanced Studies at Princeton, art historians, all sorts of people. That's just a myth. I don't know why it was propagated exactly. I'd have to look in detail. He certainly wanted them to
Look
come.
at the correspondence.
He
wrote a letter that said no.
Yeah, there's a long correspondence. He was desperate to have him come. Certainly, the correspondence is very clear that he wants them to come. And I'm sorry, I just don't remember exactly why in the end they don't come. But there's certainly lots of correspondence where he's eager. He boasts about it. He says Albert Einstein's one of the greatest minds of our era. So there may have been someone who insulted him at the end, and that finally tipped the balance. But he certainly wasn't that he was anti-Einstein or against anyone. There was a whole crowd of people who he was encouraging to come from the Center for Advanced Studies. And I'm sorry, because that correspondence did get into my book, among the tens of thousands of letters I read, it's one that's fled my mind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.